to 131. I say, Hegel finishes the chapter by wrapping up his arguments as to why the sound common sense perception, that is, sensuous universality, oh goodness, why did I write it like that? That was not great rating. Let me say that again. Hegel finishes the chapter by wrapping up his arguments as to why the sound common sense perception, or sensuous universality, tries to use as a solid rationale is actually just vacuous sophistry. Yeah, I need to rewrite that. I'm just looking at it like, what? I really like that. All right. Anyways, he lambasts the idea that we can depend upon rigid structures to truly understand the world. We cannot take the world we perceive through our senses at face value because it requires us to delve further in order to get a better understanding. Furthermore, this sets up the idea that science and philosophy does not and cannot grant us a finished story, chasing after such solidified ideas the way common sense does will only lead us astray as we inevitably learn more. Philosophy instead seeks to master the dynamic nature of mental models to constantly gain a better understanding of the world as it appears to our consciousness and of consciousness itself. Gain a better understanding of consciousness itself. Yeah, I really should probably rewrite that. It's not a good not a good description. But let's see what Dr. Sadler says. So he says Hegel now brings the section to a close, noting that the interplay between sense perception and the universal have revealed opposition within the very object of consciousness itself, a split between the unified one and the also of relation with others. Perception now grasps the object as it is in itself, as a universal, but as for something. Yeah, for the understanding or intellect. Right. Perception now grasps the object as it is in itself, as a universal, but as for something for the understanding or intellect. Perception lapses into the kind of sophistry when it attempts to do away with the opposition within the object of perception, focusing on the different aspects without acknowledging their contradiction. This sophistry itself gives way to a sound common sense, which remains unable to grasp more than the essences more than essences as abstractions. Goodness. While common sense and sophistry reveal themselves when pushed to their limits as engaging with untruth. Philosophy deals with the concrete determinate content, aiming at grasping their truth in their dynamic relations with consciousness. Awesome. Yeah, he had a better explanation there. I think mine's of course, more I guess layman terms, but he used the terms of um the book here. Let's get into a new one.
In the dialectic of sense certainty, seeing and hearing have been lost to consciousness. And as perception, consciousness has arrived at thoughts, which it brings together for the first time in the unconditioned universal. This, now if it were taken as an inert simple essence, would itself be in turn nothing else than the one-sided extreme of being for self. For it would then be confronted by non-essence, but if it were related to this, it would itself be unessential, and consciousness would not have escaped from the deceptions of the perceptual process. However, this universal has proved to be one which has returned into itself out of such a conditioned being for self. This unconditioned universal, which is now the true object of consciousness, is still just an object for it. Consciousness has not yet grasped the notion of the unconditioned as notion. It is
Okay, saying a lot. Let me back up because when we first dive into this, it's been a couple weeks, and I have to slow it down a little bit. Let me reread what he said in my own words. All right, so in the dialectic of sense certainty, seeing and hearing have been lost to consciousness, and as perception, consciousness has arrived at thoughts, which it brings together for the first time in the unconditioned universal. So basically, kind of recapping what we learned before, you know, um, we in the dialectic of sense certainty, meaning like how we begin to understand our senses, right? We had this assumption before that our perceptions gave us the truth of what's out there because we're seeing it, right? But in the dialectic, in the process of getting to know what we're actually looking at and thinking about, we actually learned that no, that's not the truth, right? That there's more to it than that. um, as perception, consciousness has arrived at thoughts, which it brings together for the first time in the unconditioned universal. Yeah. And then this now, if it were taken as an inert simple essence, would be in itself nothing else than the one sided extreme of being for itself or being for self. for it would then be confronted by non-essence. So if we would take that at face value, right, then we would say, okay, this is the essence of things, right? This is the one-sided nature of this thing. Like it is, a chair is a chair because it's a chair, right? But no, we can go further here. But if it were related to this, it would itself be unessential, and consciousness would not have escaped from the deceptions of the perceptual process, right? We like to say the chair is a chair, but right, that essence of a chair is in of itself unessential, right? It doesn't really tell us what a chair actually is, and so our perceptions wouldn't really have, you know, told us anything. Wouldn't have brought us anywhere. Let's see. However, this universal has proved to be one which has returned into itself out of such a condition being for self. This unconditioned universal, which is not the true object of consciousness, is still just an object for it. Consciousness has not yet grasped the notion of the unconditioned as notion. So now we have to think about, you know, that what he means by conditioned and unconditioned. The universe has proved to be one which has returned into itself out of such a conditioned being for itself. So, like the idea that again, a chair is a chair, right? Is it a chair because it's a chair, right? It's for itself. It's you know what it is. But we can see that this unconditioned universal, right? Like the idea of just a chair itself, could be this universal thing. But then we have to think about like the object as like what is an object, right? What do we mean by chair and all this other stuff? We can break it down in that manner. So eventually, he gets this idea of a notion, right? The general shape of things, this, grasping the concept, right? Um, so we have to have consciousness kind of grapple with this idea of what an unconditioned notion is. So I how I'm putting it, that's how I'm understanding it, right? Trying to put it into my own words. Let's
Essential
get
to
into this
distinction
a
in
little bit.
principle, but consciousness is not yet for itself the notion, and consequently does not recognize itself in that reflected object. For us, this
Sorry.
is to another and has thus become notion in principle, but consciousness is not yet for itself the notion, and consequently does not recognize itself in that reflected
Mm.
object. For us, this object is developed through the movement of consciousness in such a way that consciousness is involved in that development, and the reflection is the same on both sides, or there is only one reflection. But since in this movement consciousness has for its content merely the objective essence and not consciousness as such, the result must have an objective significance for consciousness. Consciousness still shrinks away from what has emerged and takes it as the essence in the objective sense.
Mm. So basically, as consciousness is trying to understand itself through these different things, right? It can't do so through such a limited means. Like we have to, as I said before, kind of delve deeper. Essentially distinguished two. For consciousness, the object has returned into itself from its relation to another and has thus become notion in principle, right? So, as we said before, or as he said in the last sections, when we're looking at an object, we're not just looking at the object, we're thinking about what the object is not, right? A chair is a chair because it's not a bed, it's not a bench, right? It's not a TV. So we look at what it is by what it's not, and that kind of gives us a reflection of what it is. Um, let's see. For us, the object has developed through movement of consciousness in such a way that consciousness is involved in that development, and the reflection is the same on both sides, or there's only one reflection. So as we looking through, kind of looking at what it's not, and we come back to what it is, and we can see that, like when you look in the mirror, you see the reflection. So is it one reflection or is it, two reflections, right? It's one reflection, but you can say it as, there's different sides of the reflection. Like if can you look at the other side of the mirror, or what can you imagine, from the mirror's perspective, if you will, right? What does the mirror see? I don't know if it's going that far, but could be an interesting way of looking at it. But yeah, since the movement of consciousness has for its content merely the objective essence and not consciousness as such, the result must have an objective significance for consciousness. Consciousness still shrinks away from what has emerged. Let's let him explain.
We have now made it past the first two sections of consciousness, sense certainty and perception, and we saw that both of them while they involved some sort of progress, also arrived at an impasse. And it's best to think of us, especially as we go forward with this work, as not simply having a section here and a section there and a section there and treating something independently of everything else. Some of the same dialectical movements that you're going to see happening in sense certainty or in perception or in force and understanding are going to be repeated later on down the line. But we should think of them as sort of ascending, as sense perception or sense certainty played itself out here. We arrived at the point of having the universal. Then we took that into perception, and we thought about this universal, and we turned our attention back to the thing, and how does the thing work? We arrive at what Hegel's calling the sophistry of common sense thinking, or of the understanding, at the end of perception, and now we're moving into a different section, force and the understanding, a longer section, and in many respects deeper, more involved, but also sort of raising things up to a higher level. I've expressed this in part by talking here about epistemology leading into metaphysics. This is a section which has a lot of metaphysics going on, and it's very murky. It's actually quite daunting to jump into it, but we're going to just plow straight ahead and see how far we can get. So Hegel is now going to bring in this term, the unconditioned universal. And what does he mean by that? The unbedingte Allgemeinheit. We've had universals up to this point, but what we've realized is that each one of these universals was actually conditioned. It was a sensuous universal. So the whiteness of the chalk or the salt would be an example of such a universal. Chalk as such would be another such universal. Now we're looking at something that is, as he says, unconditioned. It has a wider scope. As a matter of fact, even to speak of it as having a wider scope is probably a little misleading, because when we're saying it's unconditioned, it doesn't have any restrictions upon it. So what could we be talking about there? That's why we're doing metaphysics. We are now investigating something that falls within the category of being as such. So he says, in sense certainty, hearing and seeing have been lost to consciousness. We've left those behind. As perception, consciousness arrived at thoughts, which it brings together for the first time in the unconditioned universal. All those things that were being diffused off in this direction or that direction are now part of the unconditioned universal. This now, if it were taken as an inert simple essence, he says, would itself be in turn nothing than the one-sided extreme of being for self, for then it would have to be confronted by non-essence. But we don't want to do that same dialectical dance once again. Instead, we want this to be a resting point. It won't turn out to be, of course, it never does. Hegel does it until we get to the end of the book. But we want to try to avoid falling into some of the same cul-de-sacs that we were in before. So he says, if it were related to this non-essence, it would be itself unessential. Consciousness would not have escaped from the deceptions of the perceptual process. We saw this worked out previously in section 130 and 131, didn't we? So we don't want to go back to that. We want to do something new here. He says, this universal has proved to be one which has returned to itself out of such a conditioned being for self. I don't write the being for self up here, and you'll see why in just a moment. So he says, this unconditioned universal, which is now the true object of consciousness. Okay, so we've got this as being the object of consciousness, the unconditioned universal. All right? That's what consciousness is really grasping. Consciousness thought that it was grasping all these sensuous particulars before. It even thought it was grasping other universals. And now it's trying to make sense out of universality as such. It's trying to say, what is going on here? What am I actually perceiving? Here's where Hegel's going to introduce one of his bifurcations, a doubling. He says, so this unconditioned universal is an object for consciousness. Consciousness has not yet grasped something that's going to be correlative to it.
Notion.
The notion, the grip, the concept, the living unity, the dynamic unity of the unconditioned universal. So consciousness is grasping it, as he's going to say, in an objective fashion. And here, objective is actually, in a certain way, in an impoverished fashion. It's not grasping the unconditioned universal as the notion. Now he's going to introduce another distinction here as well that we want to pay attention to. He says,
Real quick, I wonder what he means by impoverished fashion. All right. I think today we think of objective as in like, oh, the kind of ultimate thing, like unbiased, if you will, things like that. But something I've seen a lot in, my own kind of understanding of the world and a little bit of philosophy is like, there's no objective, right? There's no objectivity. Because we can't be outside of the system, right? We can't be outside of reality in order to get a truly objective sense. Our very existence is itself, subjective. So I wonder what he means by objective here and the impoverished form of it. I'm thinking he might mean like objective is as in like literally an object, right? Like we're seeing it as if it's an object, which can be impoverished because as an object, we don't see how it's connected to everything else, right? We don't see, the full wealth of that object, how its network, its supply chain, if you will, right? You don't want to break it down like that. You can say like, what makes up this object, its relationship with other things, we don't see all that if we see it as an object, in an objective way. I wonder if that's what he's saying here.
it's essential to distinguish between the object that's returned into itself from its relation to another, and thus has become a notion in principle. So we have an object that is a notion in, let's call it in theory, right?
Principle.
And then
Change that up.
we have the notion, which requires that consciousness become for itself a notion. What does all this mean? Is this a purely nominal distinction, as we might say? What's the difference between grasping something objectively and grasping something in terms of its notion? In one sense, you can grasp its notion objectively. What is that thing? In another sense, and this is where Hegel is getting at the role of consciousness, you're only grasping it as a notion if you also are realizing that the very consciousness by which you, who are consciousness, is making sense of this, is also a notion, and that those two notions, subject and object, are in some way being interconnected with each other in ways that are not quite yet clear. But this much at least is clear for Hegel, that we have to see that consciousness is in fact itself a notion. So he says it doesn't recognize itself in the reflected object. It thinks that the object is something separate from it. For us, the object is developed through the movement of consciousness in such a way that consciousness is involved in that development. This is something that's been stressed and has been brought home to us over and over and over again. Consciousness, as it's being conscious of something, is involved as an activity in making sense of that. The unraveling of these dialectical threads has been an activity of consciousness. So he says there is only one reflection. But since in this movement, consciousness has for its content merely the objective essence and not consciousness as such, that is, consciousness is looking at this thematically, it's doing a metaphysics of the object, but it's not yet grasping itself reflexively, doing a metaphysics of the subject. Because it's doing that, he says, the result must have an objective significance for consciousness. Consciousness still shrinks away from what has emerged and takes it as the essence in the objective sense, not yet in its full conceptual sense.
Right. So yeah, I think I'm on the kind of thing there where, like, by objective we mean taking it as an object, right? Taking it as it's a thing in and of itself that's not related to yourself, even though it actually is. And that's what it means by the notion of things, right? By understanding the concept, you realize that, this object, this objective view is actually, a mutual relationship, right? Like that, like the way in which, like, go back to the reflection, right? If we see, you could say you're seeing your reflection objectively, right? You see an objective reflection, but really that reflection would exist without you there, right? Like, and if you don't understand, like, if you don't understand that interplay, then you wouldn't really understand what you're looking at, right? It's like to say, like, in the reflection, do you understand what you're seeing? Like, do you understand that this reflection is not you, it's not another person? Or do you understand that this reflection is you, but also it's not you, because, like, you can't, it's not a real person, right? It's not you itself. You can't, if you try to touch your reflection, you're not touching you, you're touching the reflection, right? I don't know if I'm making sense with all that, but I think I'm understanding what he's saying, right? Like, the objective thing is like this, seeing it from outside of ourselves, but not really understanding our own relationship with that and how our consciousness kind of changes that and back and forth.
With this, the understanding has indeed superseded its own untruth and the untruth of the object. What has emerged for it as a result is the notion of the true, but only as the implicit being of the true, which is not yet notion, or which lacks the being for self of consciousness, and which the understanding, without knowing itself therein, lets go its own way. This truth follows out its own essence, so that consciousness plays no part in its free realization, but merely looks on and simply apprehends it. To begin with, therefore, we must step into its place and be the notion which develops and fills out what is contained in the result. It is through awareness of this completely developed object, which presents itself to consciousness as something that immediately is, that consciousness first becomes explicitly a consciousness that comprehends its object.
I think that's what I was saying.
Here in section 133, Hegel is playing this out a little bit more, and we're going to see an interesting shift from the understanding to consciousness, and then to this we that I put a question mark next to for reasons you'll see in just a minute. Now, he begins this by saying that what's going on here, so this is going back to what happened in perception, is that the understanding and its object are now related to each other in a certain way. The understanding has come to understand that it contains a certain measure of untruth, right? We talked about this in terms of deception, but it's also come to grasp that the object itself contains a certain untruth, that it's not fully what it pretended to be, or rather didn't pretend to be, but understanding took it as at the beginning. As the object was unraveled into things like the also and the one, the chiasm of being for self and being for another, all those sorts of things, its untruth, the fact that it is not entirely what it was to be, was revealed in it. And this has the product for the understanding of leading us to the concept of the true, as he says. So let's see. He says, what has emerged for it as a result is the notion of the true. But now this is only the implicit notion of the true. It's not fully the notion of the true. We just saw in the previous passage what makes it fully the notion. Well, consciousness has to be involved. So now we have a shift from just understanding, which you might say is part of consciousness or a mode of consciousness, but not the totality of it. We have a shift from understanding to consciousness per se. And consciousness now looks on the true. It tries to grasp the notion of it. But as we saw in the last section, it does so in an objective manner, which means that in this case it just looks on. And don't confuse this, by the way, with sometimes they'll translate anschauen as looking on, but that can also be translated as intuition. This is just zuschauen, just looking. It apprehends it. It grasps it. It takes it in. But it takes it in as something other than itself. Although it has consciousness of the object and also has consciousness of the true or truth, it hasn't yet made it entirely its own. In part because it's taking this rather passive attitude towards it. So Hegel says, what happens in this case is the understanding doesn't know itself in what's happening, and it lets the true just kind of go its own way. Consciousness just watches this happen. Consciousness doesn't intervene and say, hey, understanding, get it together. Or it doesn't say that to itself either. So he says, the truth follows out its own essence. Consciousness plays no part in its free realization. The question is, what about this over here, this free realization? You see, truth for Hegel isn't just a matter of noting the correspondence between, say, things in language or things in thought. It's rather, seeing the truth as it develops, as it actualizes itself, as it engages in activity, as it unfolds. So, what can we do here? Here's where Hegel is going to bring in the we. And he says something really interesting here. He talks about this we as doing several different things. One is that the we inserts itself into the place, the Stelle of consciousness, its slot, you might say. And so he says, we must step into its place and be its notion, which develops and fills out what is contained in the result. So the we is consciousness that is conscious of being the notion. It is not merely conscious of the notion as an object, it is conscious of being the notion. So what does this get us? He says, be the notion which develops and fills out what is contained in the result. It's through awareness of this completely developed object, which presents itself to consciousness as something that immediately is, that's a key word right there, immediately is, that consciousness first becomes explicitly a consciousness that comprehends its object. So consciousness is being conscious of the very fact that it grasps the truth and that it grasps the object through the understanding. This is consciousness now taking stock of itself.
Yep. We get that metacognition coming in.
The result was the unconditioned universal, initially in the negative and abstract sense that consciousness negated its one-sided notions and abstracted them. In other words, it gave them up. But the result has implicitly a positive significance. In it, the unity of being for self and being for another is posited. In other words, the absolute antithesis is posited as a self-identical essence. At first sight, this seems to concern only the form of the moments in reciprocal relation. But being for self and being for another are the content itself as well, since the antithesis in its truth can have no other nature than the one yielded in the result. That is, that the content taken in perception to be true belongs, in fact, only to the form in the unity of which it is dissolved. This content is likewise universal. There can be no other content which, by its particular constitution, would fail to fall within this unconditioned universality. A content of this kind would be some particular way or other of being for itself and of being in relation to an other. But in general, to be for itself and to be in relation to an other constitutes the nature and essence of the content, whose truth consists in its being unconditionally universal, and the result is simply and solely universal.
So yeah, I guess the process of the process of this kind of metacognition of realizing, hey, consciousness is conscious for itself, or even if you're just talking about the object, I think, was he calling that out initially? Maybe I'm adding to it. Oh yeah, that was the first one. Oops. The result was the unconditioned universal, initially in a negative and abstract sense that consciousness negated its one-sided notions and abstracted them. But the result has implicitly the positive significance in it. Unity of being for itself and being for another is positive. In other words, the opposite antithesis is positive. Yeah. So as consciousness looks at other things to say, oh, it's this is what consciousness is for, right? Like looking at things and understanding things, and being able to understand that is what those are. But then you realize, no, it's also for itself, right? It's understanding itself what consciousness is, because that reflective, as you like to say, process requires, or that process of knowing things and understanding things requires a reflective aspect, right? Requires of looking at how you're looking at things, right? Like you can't understand, like you won't be able to understand the truth, right, of a chair, or I keep using this, but like of anything, without like delving deeper into it, but without realizing that your current perception of it, like it's you looking at this in this manner that limits your own understanding. And so you have to realize that, oh, my perception is limited. Like I have to look at it from a different perspective. You know, I have to use this instrument, I have to do this test, this experiment in order to figure out more information about this thing. And so it requires a, understanding of the self, the limits of consciousness, in order to grow that understanding. Yeah, I think that's what's going on here.
Universal. A new distinction that Section 134 is going to introduce a new distinction that Hegel is going to play off of quite a lot throughout this entire section, Force and the Understanding. That between content, Inhalt in German, and form, just form. And, these are correlatives, right? When we think about, something having a particular form, we're thinking about something in a general way or a universal way, and then it can be filled out by particular content. Or you could even just think of forms that you have to fill in online, for example, or by hand. With content, you put in whatever content you like, and in a certain sense, the form is what's really most important to us, isn't it? That everything has to be structured in a particular way. What content you want to put in there, well, that's just up to you. That's the particularity. That's the arbitrariness of it. So you go to get your driver's license, you fill out a form, and they give you back a form that is your driver's license, and it shows your picture. That's the content for that, and your date of birth, and all those other sorts of things. Now, we can have some sort of general idea like that in mind, but Hegel's going to play around with this in this section, and we're going to see that things can be both content and form at the same time, and there's a lot more content that we wanted. There's a lot more content than we thought, given what we wanted. Now, you notice he's also bringing up these old distinctions from the previous sections, being for self and being for other. You remember that chiastic structure that we talked about, and the fact that these are different from each other. There's, in fact, an absolute antithesis between them. They're like polarities, you might say. But at the same time, one thing is only a being for self insofar as it is a being for another, and likewise, it is only a being for another insofar as it is a being for self, insofar as it has a relation to itself. So this also allows him to say that there is a posited unity there, a unity that we have realized and we're sort of placing out there. Notice I don't have consciousness in this at all. That's going to come up in the next section. So at the same time, these two things exist in an absolute antithesis to each other. They couldn't be more opposed, and yet they are expressions of a self-identical essence. There's a unity connecting those two together. And we can even say, hey, wait a second, these are even opposed to each other, aren't they? So we have opposition in several different ways. We have opposition about whether there's opposition going on. We have opposition to unifying happening. It's really quite complex if you map it out. Now, where does this content and form stuff come in? So let's chart that out. Hegel says that all of this here is actually the unconditioned universal. He says the result was the result was the unconditioned universal initially in the negative and abstract sense, that consciousness negated as one-sided notions and abstracted them. In other words, it gave them up. But this is the result. The result has a positive significance. In it, the unity of being for self and being for another is posited. In other words, the absolute antithesis is posited as a self-identical essence. And he says, at first this seems to concern only the form of the moments in reciprocal relation. So we can talk about the form of these units, of these unities, of these metaphysical principles, we could say. Now, each one of them has its own form, right? Because I have being for self, and so does this chalk, and so does this chalkboard, and so do you. And the content of your being for self is not the same thing as my content of being for self. So there's some content and some form in both of these. But we can also talk about the positive unity itself as perhaps providing a kind of form, can't we? So he says, here we go. Being for self and being for another are the content itself as well, since the antithesis in its truth can have no other nature than the one yielded in the result. The content, taken in perception to be true, belongs in fact only to the form in the unity of which it is dissolved. This content is likewise universal. There can be no other content which by its particular constitution would fail to fall within this unconditioned universality. So the unconditioned universality is actually itself form for the content of everything on this side. This is content, this is content, this are also in certain ways content. We realize that this was. All of these are content for the unconditioned universality. Why? Because it's unconditioned. Because it is, you might say, the form of any of these sorts of structures. So it doesn't matter what content we put in at this point. It's going to have its connection to the form, which is revealed in the structure here. So he says, A content of this kind would be some particular way or other of being for itself and being in relation to another. So here we get to my being for self and my being for another is not the same thing as your being for self and being for another, except I suppose insofar as we're both human beings and have the same general structure of consciousness, in which case we're veering towards this unconditioned universal, aren't we? Except in that case, it's conditioned by the concept of humanity. But if we're trying to get to the, totally unconditioned, we have to abstract even away from that. So he says, in general, to be for itself and to be in relation to another constitutes the nature and essence of the content, right? The nature and essence of the content. But the truth of that content is it's being unconditionally universal. As we get to the universal, we get closer and closer and closer to what the truth is. The truth is not something we can simply take for granted. The truth is something that is hard to attain and requires us to make efforts in order to win, to recover, to take away. So he says, the result is simply and solely universal. So now we're going to shift over to this side.
Okay.
But because this unconditioned universal is an object for consciousness, there emerges in it the distinction of form and content. And in the shape of content, the moments look like they did when they first presented themselves. On one side, a universal medium of many subsistent matters, and on the other side, a one, reflected into itself, in which their independence is extinguished. The former is the dissolution of the thing's independence. That is, the passivity that is a being for another. The latter is being for self. We have to see how these moments exhibit themselves in the unconditioned universality, which is their essence. It is clear at the outset that since they exist only in this universality, they are no longer separated from one another at all, but are in themselves essentially self-superseding aspects, and what is posited is only their transition into one another.
So yeah, going back to what he was saying with the how an object has, this multiplicities, but and that those multiplicities kind of show how it's like for different things, right? For others. But the object is the object, right? It's the combination of all these things, and so it's for itself. And it has this relationship of kind of combining these aspects, I guess you could say. Yeah, that transition into one another.
Since they exist only in this universality, they are no longer separated from one another at all, but are in themselves essentially self-superseding aspects, and what is posited is only their transition into one another. You notice that the key difference here is that consciousness has now been brought to bear upon the unconditioned universality. So as we're looking about this content-form distinction, we thought that the unconditioned universality was sort of form itself. It turns out that it itself possesses content and form. And the content side is where Hegel's going to be focusing on in this section. He doesn't really talk much about the form, but we're going to see that that has a very important role coming up in the next very long section. So he says about this content, hey, there's things going on in this that we recognize from our previous investigations in these other sections. What are they? The one, reflected into itself, right? And the also, the universal medium. The universal medium is a plurality of matters, as he says, and this ends up being for another, and this ends up being for self. So all of this is packed into the unconditioned universal. He says, because it's not consciousness, all of this is emerging from that. The shape of the content, the moments look like they did when they first presented themselves back in perception, right? On one's a universal medium, on the other side of one reflected into itself. Thanks to the former is the dissolution of the thing's independence. We have the thing coming back to us again, and the latter is its being for self. We have to see, he says, how these moments exhibit themselves where? In this unconditioned universality. So now we're going to be looking at these same matters, these same moments. These moments were of the thing. Now we're not so concerned just with the thing, which is in effect the content. We're really interested in the form of what's happening with unconditioned universality and how consciousness plays into that. So he says, it's clear at the outset that they exist only in this universality. They're no longer separated from one another at all, but they're essentially self-superseding aspects. What is posited is only their transition into one another. What we have there is a little bit of foreshadowing about Hegel's treatment of force, which is going to be coming up very soon.
Okay. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah. As always, there's some great stuff here. I didn't make as many comments because I'm quite hungry. I didn't skip breakfast again. I keep doing that, but I really want to do this before my day gets started. But yeah, thanks as always for listening, for watching. Let me know what you think, what you learned in this section, and yeah, have a great one. And look at my nails. I'm probably gonna get them off. It's been like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and they're chipping on one of these hands, but I don't know what I'm gonna do next. We'll see. But as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching once again. Let me know what you thought about, what you learned in this section, and have a good day. See ya. Bye bye.